So I believe that indigenous knowledge observation gives us the understanding of how certain things interact in the ecosystem. And once you have that knowledge, biomimicry gives us a framework to be able to now replicate that approach or strategy. And based on that, I used my knowledge of playing with ants when I was a kid now to solve an engineering problem.
Welcome to our last episode of this season of the AskNature podcast. Our final conversation is with Gamelihle Sibanda.
What I love about this conversation is that Gama has essentially been practicing biomimicry his whole life. His formative years were spent being in relationship with natural systems in Zimbabwe, where designing with nature was a part of life and culture.
And then as an engineer, he studied biomimicry as a design approach and has been applying it in different contexts around the world. And he's helped spread the seeds of biomimicry further through his own video series and podcasts. We'd spoken a few times in the past, and it is a thrill to get to bring this audience into the conversation with him today. Gamelihle Sibanda, welcome to the AskNature podcast.
Thank you. It's an honor to be invited to share my thoughts, and hopefully I'll also learn something.
That's our goal every day. So you have a long and storied experience in biomimicry. One of my favorite quotes was where you said that you were born in nature, then spent 20 years being taken out of it, and then biomimicry brought you back.
Yeah, that's correct. I did spend the first years of my teenage life in a rural setup. So I was born in the African savannah in Zimbabwe specifically. And where I grew up in my normative years was a place called Nkai, which is deep inside Zimbabwe. It's a rural area. Takes you about maybe 3-4 hours to get to the city, to the big city. Yeah, that's why we had to pretty much grow our own food and have our own milk, have our own meat and all that.
Yeah. So you said that at the time, it wasn't seen as a great benefit to be growing up in a village like that, and that you were doing these experiences engaging with nature just kind of on your own. Give us a picture of what was life like there? What were the different attitudes towards being there close to nature and engaging with it?
Yeah, so my parents were teachers, so they would from time to time relocate to different areas. And one time we found ourselves, when I was young, in a rural area. And at that time, the fancy thing was to be in a big city. We did have access to the big city. And when I went to the big city, all of a sudden, organic food somehow became premium and expensive. But that's another interesting thing because we never bought vegetables. We grew everything organically. And I'm like, this is the stuff we ate in the village when people were laughing at us. And now they are calling our food premium. What is this? The other thing maybe I can mention to you is if I had an ailment like a stomach ache or whatever, I never told my parents. I'll just get outside the fence, grab the necessary herbs from the plants that we knew, mix them with my porridge. And sometimes my mom would come and find me mixing with my porridge. And she'd say, so when did you start having a stomach ache? I was telling her, no, I've been having it since yesterday, but it's almost done now. Because for us, curing yourself or learning how to cure others was just something that happened as we grew up. It wasn't something that you really said, I need to go and get training for this.
But that's exactly the kind of thing that we're now looking at training people for, right? So what from that experience of seeing it so incorporated gives you ideas about how we can better get adoption and transition back to these ways for the people whose communities do not look at medicine and vegetables that way?
Yeah, so I think one of the things we need to understand, nature tells us about the genius of place. And this is very important. I give you an example since we've been talking about medicinal plants and all these kind of things. One of the reasons why people will tell you, oh, those medicines from the village don't work. It's because, certain plants grow in a particular biome. the soils there and the nutrients there, they are specific to that area. So when you take a particular plant and then you try and transposition it in a different location in another continent and try and cure the same disease, it may not be as effective because in that new area where you're growing, the same nutrients are not there. It's a different biome. So the thing that biomimicry tells us is to understand and respect the genius of place and understand the context in which you are working. So I think that's one of the things that I've learned, that don't just assume something works in a particular scale and therefore is going to work in another scale. So the issue of scales, it's important to understand. At certain scales, certain things cannot be replicated. That's why biomimicry teaches us to understand the genius of place, understand the scales before you start emulating.
So much of that is the detailed context of where an organism grows, how it functions, all that is influencing its growth and development. And so much of the knowledge that we have is so focused on very specific aspects of things, where we're not experiencing things directly every day and knowing it from personal experience. You're going in and trying to learn something new from something in a place that you've never been before. So how do you think we go about getting that full, broad, contextual awareness of everything at a larger scale and for more of the global population?
So I believe that indigenous knowledge observation gives us the understanding of how certain things interact in the ecosystem. And once you have that knowledge, biomimicry gives us a framework to be able to now replicate that approach or strategy. And then on top of that, now you layer AI, which then enables you to go to scale to any geography, to any corner of the world. Hence, my interest in the nexus of indigenous knowledge, biomimicry, and ethical AI, so that if you put these things together, you go from knowledge acquisition, knowledge understanding, you go to knowledge replication, and then you go to knowledge scale-up.
Yeah, so there's the ethics at the level of AI there. And then how do we think about the ethics of working with indigenous groups? How do we make sure that everyone is in a good reciprocal relationship and it's not just kind of mining information, but really doing something together?
Yeah, so this is one of the biggest risks. I recall one time I was talking to a traditional healer, and I asked them, you have all these cures and all this knowledge. Why don't you put it in books and share it with the rest of the world? And they said, of course, where I grew up, knowledge was to be shared. But the problem is these big international companies, they come, they take our medicinal solutions, they package them and put in a labeled bottle, and then they patent it and tell us we can no longer harvest our own plants. We now have to buy medicines from them because they own the patent. So why should I share my secrets? Where I grew up, medicinal cure was not something for an individual person or an individual company to benefit from. Medicines were owned and for the benefit of the entire community. So we didn't have this way where somebody monetizes medicinal solutions to the extent that it then compels people to start hoarding the information.
That shows such a different attitude towards the idea of medicine and relationships to nature overall. So much of Western relationships to nature is based on the owning of nature and of knowledge. And that's such a completely different attitude than this collective vision.
Yeah, so I think the best way to understand what I think is the best model is to go to the ecosystem. I remember when I first spoke about this open sourcing of knowledge, such as knowledge that benefits the community, someone says to me, are you a socialist or a communist? I said, no, I believe in ecosystems. In an ecosystem, every organism is putting out benefits into the ecosystem. without even knowing sometimes who is going to benefit. You never see a monkey driving a truckload of bananas because the monkey knows that I will get bananas when I need them. No one needs to hoard them. And the banana plant puts out the fruits knowing very well that the monkey is going to take them and go and poop the seeds far away and help with propagation. So these are some of the things that happen in nature. But how then do we generate the knowledge? We observe in nature. That's where biomimicry comes in. Let's say if you watch monkeys getting leaves and wrapping themselves with leaves, and you wonder, why are they doing this? And then you understand that they're actually protecting themselves from mosquito bites. And then you take that plant, you analyze it, you find out the active ingredients, and then that begins to inform our own mosquito repellent that is natural. For us, we need to observe and learn. That's why nature is supposed to be our teacher, our mentor, and our measure. Because if we observe what nature is doing, the solutions are there already. I'm not here trying to imply that humans are not nature. We are part of nature. The only difference between humans and the rest of nature, as Janine Benias said one time, was that humans are the only species that fouls their nest. The rest of the species do not foul their nest because they think about tomorrow and creating a regenerative environment. But I've since added to that myself. I'm saying, I think humans, we are the alien species. Because if we belonged here, we wouldn't treat this planet with such carelessness and neglect. We are behaving as if this doesn't belong to us. Therefore, we are the aliens.
That is a wild way of looking at it. It's like, as a species, we're matching that experience you had individually of starting out well connected and then through formal education getting separated further and further from what really is the home where we do belong. It's like once you graduate from academia, you need to go back to nature school to relearn reading nature itself.
And I can maybe share an anecdote about learning. My grandmother, in one of my YouTube channels, I talk about how I think my grandmother was sometimes smarter than someone with a PhD. And I give an example of how my grandmother would be walking outside, and then she would see certain insects emerging from the ground. And she would tell you, we're going to heavy rains in 2 weeks' time. And then you're like, how do you know, Grandma? She says, look at those insects. They are coming out. So we're having rain. But think about now these climatologists, people who need now to predict what we'll have in 2 weeks. They need to know the current wind speed. They need to know the humidity. They need to know the temperature. They need to know the altitude. They need to know the wind speed. They feed all this information into an algorithm, and then it spits out some projections. And they need heavy AI now to be able to even project for longer durations like 2 weeks. And then my grandma, all she did was look at insects emerging from the ground. And the same outcome, you arrive at it. And sometimes you would even look at leaves and say, oh, this tree by now, it should have put out the flowers. Because it hasn't, we are going to have a drought this year. And then our own modern knowledge would need computers, supercomputers, El Nino that, El Nino this. Oh yeah, we can tell you we're going to have a drought this year. And then you say to yourself, why don't we just combine our indigenous knowledge systems with the modern education we have, and then we get something that is actually well researched and well balanced.
That's beautiful and opens the pathway to some of the other work that you've done. So you have this childhood in the rural villages, and now as an adult, you're there across countries working with the UN, 18 countries that you visited with the employment-intensive investment programs. And you really function on a very large scale now. So what are some of those challenges that you're trying to address through these programs, and how do they relate to trying to work with it on that global level? And how does that relate to the local level?
When we started learning about biomimicry, all that stuff which I was just not deliberately learning, but I was just immersed in nature. And it's something that is handy now. I remember I used to even play with the insects. That was my favorite pastime. I would go and play with the ants and manipulate them. When I say manipulate, like I would start new colonies, get bread, throw in breadcrumbs and see if they start a new colony and all those kind of things. So when I got to biomimicry and started learning about pheromones and ants, it has been the most enriching thing in my life, especially when I followed my biomimicry trajectory. Okay, so one of the areas I work in, of course, with the UN is on public employment programs. I look at nature-based solutions as a way of intervention, obviously, to augment the grey infrastructure that we have. Let's take coastal areas, for instance. If people want to build, say, a hotel by the coast, one of the first things they do is to go and remove the sand dunes because they are blocking the view of the guests. They want the guests to have a nice view to the ocean. But what are those sand dunes doing? They are actually preventing storm surges. They are actually managing the storms. The same with mangroves. Some of them, they will cut the trees. Let's give our guests a nice view of the ocean. They cut the trees, and those same mangrove trees are the ones that are actually attenuating the storm surges. So one of the things that we do now is to make people aware of the ramifications of removing natural infrastructure such as sand dunes and mangroves, and even getting people to replant these things and rehabilitate the sand dunes so that they stabilize. So this is some of the work I'm doing. And I can share with you an anecdote. Because I work in both peaceful countries and fragile countries. One time I was working in a war country in Somalia, and I needed to go and advise on a community where there was a small town, and about 30,000 people lived there. But whenever it flooded, people's houses would flood as well, to the extent that I was talking to one of the residents. They were telling me that they would stand on their bed because the water would come and flood inside the house. And one of the things then I realized was that they'd interfered with the way the river wants to go. You know, rivers by nature, they want to go in like a snaking way. You don't build a straight river. So they diverted the water and tried to force it to go where it didn't want to go. So I went there to look and say, no, let's restore the course where water wants to go. Allow it to go where it wants to go. But to do that, we needed to then realign and train the river. And we needed to find the right soil to do that. But I only had 30 minutes, a window of 30 minutes to do that before the anti-government elements could come and capture me or, you know. So they said to me, you know, you have a 30-minute window. The moment we start driving there, they will know we are coming. They'll start driving. But because they are far away, we'll give you 20 minutes on site and then we get out. So when I went there, I said to everybody, we don't have time to dig the soil and look for the good soil. So I want everyone to look for termite mounds where the termites are coming out. And everyone went into the bush and they were telling me, oh, I found a termite mound. I said, let's see. I simply looked at what the termites were bringing from under the ground. And based on that, I was able to tell them, here we've got good construction material, here we don't. I used my knowledge of playing with ants when I was a kid now to solve an engineering problem.
That's beautiful. And that also brings the whole conversation kind of around, as you had said, starting from traditional Indigenous knowledge, developing through biomimetic ways of learning and applying, international work, AI, and then seeing how the AI can actually inform the way that we apply the biomimicry and help to protect some of those natural systems themselves. How does that look to you, ways in which AI can be used not to separate us from nature, but can be part of how we stay connected to it.
Yeah, so let's think about a simple case of resource optimization. And maybe let me start even with a simpler thing, which is navigation. If you look at, say, insects like my favorite ants, foraging for food, we know that from biomimicry, when they find food, they will lay a pheromone, which tells the rest of the ants, I found food here. The stocks are quite high, go there, and then they go there. And when the stocks are depleted, they put another pheromone. Sorry, guys, the stock is running out, don't go there anymore. And that reduces wastage. And then let me take it now, maybe to a human level. Again, we have people, maybe they could be hiking and things like that. And then there's a storm coming, there is a hurricane coming, or whatever. Why don't we put in our hiking routes something that is environmentally aware to be able to warn the hikers as they walk that, guys, the environment is changing. We are likely to have a storm, hurricane coming. Don't keep climbing the mountain. And then you take it to another level now with AI and say, all right, we can optimize the routing. We now have probably, I can't remember how much food is wasted. I think I saw close to half the food being wasted in the US, where somebody sleeps hungry and someone has excess is thrown away. If you take all these concepts I've been talking about, the route optimization, optimizing our hiking routes and all that, and now you use AI to go really global and be able to say, if we use AI and coordinate with all these restaurants and coordinate with all these food sources, we're able now to say, you know what? We've got so many tomatoes at that warehouse, which are going to go bad in 2 days. Who needs tomatoes so that those tomatoes can then be rerouted to where they are needed before they are thrown away as waste? And again, the moment we do this and optimize the flow of these kind of resources, we reduce the amount of even food that we need to grow, but we reduce the amount of fertilizer, we reduce the amount of chemicals, and by so doing, we even begin to help protect the environment. But it's not only protecting through the commercial farming that we all know. Sometimes we might even rethink the way we even grow food. I'll end with an anecdote here. I went to visit the Maya people in Mexico. I think they are now left in Mexico, Honduras, and Guatemala. I spent 2 weeks living amongst them. And one day, one of them says, tomorrow I'm going to show you my farm. So we woke up in the morning, we walked for 30 minutes. As we were walking, we were pulling fruits from the trees and eating and going. There were mangoes, there were guavas. After 30 minutes, I'm like, so where is your farm? He says, but we've been in my farm all along. I'm like, we've been in your farm? Where? He says, well, this is an edible forest that I have as my farm. What did you expect? I'm like, I thought we were going to cut the trees and grow something. He says, no, we just go into the forest and plant fruit trees. So that's my farm. So that changed my mindset entirely about what it means to do farming. I think if we are to really protect nature, we need to see how does nature actually do its own farming. It doesn't cut down trees and bring tractors. So that was an aha moment for me, which I took back and shared, and I try to practice it now when I'm interacting with people in my village. I tell them, stop burning and clearing the land, just plant there and let nature do its thing.
Gama, that was such a great illustration of humans not only being aware of that connection to all the rest of nature, but actively engaging in that relationship to create an environment that is supportive of all of the living things in that area. And I think that really shows us that model of where humans can go from where we are. We can see that on a small scale, and that could be the footprint of humans on a large scale as well through these lessons and those seeds of knowledge getting passed and planted around the world. Thank you for being a carrier of these seeds and sharing them with us today and with everyone that you do around the world.
Thank you. I'm a perpetual learner. I challenge myself to learn something new every day. And I'm a perpetual life student. And I am hoping that before I go to bed tonight, I will have learned something. And I'm a storyteller as well. So I can talk until, in my language, we say, until the cows come home.
That's great. Well, you've shared wonderful stories and lots of new ideas with us today. So thanks again for joining us here on the Ask Nature podcast.
Thank you.
Wow, an incredible conversation to close the first series of the AskNature podcast that ties together so much of what our wonderful guests have explored over the course of the 6 episodes. The lessons that I hope we're leaving you with are, firstly, we are nature. Secondly, those of us that have lost our nature connection can get it back through simply listening, watching, and demonstrating a humility to learn. And lastly, there are so many rich Indigenous traditions and cultural philosophies that we could learn from that have been practicing a deep intertwining between nature and people for thousands of years. We do not need to reinvent the reconnection and regeneration of our relationship with nature. It is within us already, waiting for our curiosity to spark it to life. Thank you to Andrew for joining me on this podcast journey.
It's really been a pleasure, Amanda. And thanks to our incredible guests and to you, listener, for joining the conversation. And we hope carrying it further into the world. And with that, we conclude this season of the Ask Nature podcast. Until next time.
The AskNature podcast is a project of the Biomimicry Institute. The podcast is hosted by me, Amanda Sturgeon, the Institute's CEO.
And by me, Andrew Howley, the Institute's chief editor. Our sound crew includes Lucas Murray and Simon Thomas George, who composed the music and sound design and mixed this episode. Audio production and story editing by Ayoade Balogun and Camilo Garzon. Executive production by Amanda, Camilo, and me. For more resources on biomimicry and regenerative design, visit us at asknature.org. To connect with fellow listeners and other professionals in biomimicry and regenerative innovation, join our online community at asknature.org/hive and enter podcast to receive 30% off your subscription. What will you ask nature next?